Hello, I'm Anne McLean for Concerts from the Library of Congress. I'm delighted to welcome you to our Rehearing Beethoven Festival, celebrating the composer's 250th anniversary. It's wonderful to be opening our festival with the distinguished Takas Quartet, one of the world's truly great quartets. Edward Dusenberry, Harumi Rhodes, Richard O'Neill, and Andras Feyer. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. We'll have the pleasure of talking with you about two of Beethoven's late string quartets in this conversation. Rehearing Beethoven is a major and very festive project in our 2021 virtual season, representing concerts, conversations, lectures, and the chance for a very deep dive into the library's remarkable collection of Beethoven treasures. You can view our Beethoven holograph manuscripts and letters on our website, and encounter some rare and fascinating items that bring this titanic figure to life. Here at the library, Beethoven's spirit is invoked in the library's main reading room, in a massive bronze statue by Theodor Bauer, and an original 1815 portrait of the composer by Johann Christoph Haeckel hangs in our Woodall Pavilion. Hearing Beethoven's music in new ways is the focus of our festival this fall. It's a celebration unique to the library, centering on performances of revelatory transcriptions of all 9 Beethoven symphonies, and I hope you'll join us for this. Today, we're fortunate to have the Takas Quartet perspective on 2 late quartets written in the last 3 years of the composer's life. First, the Opus 132 quartet that you'll be playing in your virtual concert for us, and also Opus 131, the composer's favorite. I know that the Beethoven quartets are particularly important for the Takas. Ed, you've described working on them as a rite of passage in your book, Beethoven for a Later Age. So I wanted to ask you about this, and also what might be, thinking of this Opus 132 quartet that people will hear on your concert, what might be any special traditions or performance practices that are unique to you?
Opus 132 is a remarkable piece full of extraordinary contrasts. The first movement is dissonant, amazing changes of mood. We've got this ethereal Thanksgiving movement that is followed immediately by a rather sassy, rude little march. And I think the reason for me that these works are a rite of passage is that they're wonderful life companions, because in our lives we have to deal with tremendous contrasts and trying to sort of make continuities out of things, even just in our own beings, contradictions that we try to resolve. And so Beethoven is extremely good at that in his music. I think when we're playing this piece, we definitely try and bring attention to those juxtapositions to make the drama of a crescendo that goes within one bar from piano to fortissimo. In the slow movement that I mentioned before, we like to make quite a difference between the chorale at the beginning. We try and play with a very pure sound, and then the more personal material, which then the 2 elements in that piece become more entwined as the piece goes on, but we try and retain very different sorts of sound in the way that we play them.
You know, I was thinking about this in terms of the year that you've just spent touring with this quartet, Opus 132 and Opus 131. Has anything changed for you at all in this past year? Any new moments that are interesting?
What personally I found extremely fascinating, how we can fill out the lower registers expressivity to play utmost intensity, character, and espressivo in the piano, and especially the pianissimo ranges. These are so fascinating. It doesn't exist in the middle and early quartets, where things are more pinpointable. But from 1 to 7, the first of the so-called late quartets, these are real problems. How we shape, how we cover, how we suppress, in order to achieve what he might have wanted.
And I think actually, just to add on to what Ondřej said about the lower voices, the fact that for the late quartets, Beethoven, for the first time in quartets, started writing out 4 lines, 4 staves, instead of combining it into 2 or 3, is precisely because he had so many ideas for each individual part.
You know, we'll have a chance to see that just for a brief flash when we look at the Opus 131 manuscript, because I know what you mean, that you see he is working on many fronts simultaneously as he sketches all the time for this. Thinking about the Heilige Dankgesang, the appellation, the title for this that Beethoven puts across the manuscript. Can you, Andras, can you tell something of the background of this story for viewers who maybe don't know the story of Beethoven's convalescence, and then speak a little bit about what the challenges are to create this extraordinary feeling of serenity? You have those 2 contrasting ideas, the very slow chorale motions, and then this brilliantly joyous new strength section. What are the challenges for the Takács in creating this movement?
First of all, we are trying to achieve a consensus if the slow section, which of the slow section should be vibrated, should be played more alive, more extrovert, and in contrast, what follows should be the opposite. So what is it what you call a human voice, full of expressivity and hope and a pious humility to the deity, and what follows could be a Gregorian chant, all its gorgeous ancient relatively simple expressivity, which rely on cathedral acoustic to really sound magnificent and spiritual? Or so should we vibrate the human voice and senza vibrato the chorale, or the human voice would be even more pious by not vibrating and giving a lush color to the Gregorian? So once we thought it out, then we can move to the section feeling new strength, where it would be all too easy to feel muscular, newly born, and flesh and blood, but in Beethoven's case, maybe it's fair to assume that a convalescent man, just taking a couple of careful baby steps first to see if the convalescing really works, and only then starts to feel secure in his physical abilities. So it's again a very sensitive tightrope, how much muscle we should infuse step by step.
This is so fascinating for someone who's not a string player, you know, to hear these challenges. I can imagine what they are, and not to digress, and this doesn't have to go into the full thing, but I remember reading about the Emerson Quartet talking about they have a technique called park and go, that they try to give extra blossoming to the sound. So each quartet comes to its own way of discussing how to create these feelings, and it's just an extraordinary challenge. You know, I was looking at background for the library's involvement with the Beethoven quartets, and the Budapest Quartet, which was in residence here for many years, played the cycle 4 times. And Boris Kroy, the violist for the Budapest, said that he felt the greatest responsibility a chamber music group can undertake is to play the Beethoven quartets, that there's no music more thrilling to the performer. And they made the cycle of quartets really known to the American public, because in the 40s and 50s, they did this cycle for live radio broadcasts across the nation. And in 1942, I know that they did the complete cycle and received 1,300 letters from listeners across the U.S. It was still new, that the concept of the 16 quartet cycle was still new. And I know that Bobby Mann used to hear those broadcasts of the first violins at the Juilliard. So the whole story of string quartets is a very intimate one. And the library's concert series history is intertwined with that, with the history and lineage of string quartet playing. Harumi, for you in particular, this is very touching for me to talk with you, because I remember you as a little girl coming to the Coolidge Auditorium with your father, Samuel Rhodes, who was my close friend in the Juilliard Quartet at that time. Do you remember that?
I do, and I was just wondering if you remember me at all. So it's yes, I remember you very well, and I don't remember every detail of every moment backstage, but I do remember some of the times that we spent together.
Yeah, I do remember you, and we could talk after this a little bit. But I wanted to say that the traditions of each quartet are very present in the library's history books, and we want to hear again more about your traditions with this work and other works, things that make your interpretations very special. The technical angle, the way that you think about coloration, and back to the convalescent, back to the Heiliger Dankgesang for one moment. The Lydian mode, Ed, maybe you would address this one. There's a reason that you talk about in your book why this particular mode works so well to reduce the harmonic tensions, or it helps Beethoven to convey this feeling of heavenly serenity, and maybe helps the performer too.
Yes, I probably should go and read my book again. But it is amazing that it means that there are very, very few accidentals written in the music. And actually, I think it's not really strictly in the Lydian mode, but there's an element of it being in a mode, and it's more a statement of intention from Beethoven that he wanted to write something really old, and that he had this idea of reaching back to Palestrina and to various other composers. And I think going back to this narrative arc of that movement, it's so interesting. It starts off with the Thanksgiving, and then it moves on to the New Strength. But then that could be the end of the movement. Yeah, I mean, the guy got better. As Andras said, he maybe didn't jump out of bed, but he felt new strength, end of story. But then why does the slow music come back again? And then we have another section which is the same music as New Strength, but it's not new anymore because we've already heard it, and he doesn't write New Strength this time. And then the slow music comes back again. And I think one realizes by the end of the movement that it's a little bit more than someone just rejoicing at a bodily recovery from a life-threatening illness. Somehow becomes something tremendously ethereal, and actually begins to feel much more like a statement about the fragility of the body, and this, if anything, it seems like the soul leaves the body towards the end of the movement. And that makes a lot of sense with the biographical circumstances, that although it's true that Beethoven recovered, he had a lot of life-threatening illnesses during his life. This was not an unusual experience for him. He knew that he would die at some point. And so it becomes a meditation on mortality as much as anything else. And that's very beautiful to feel that arc of the music. And I think we try and present that the slow sections change in the music, and they should change in our interpretation. So we try in that last section to do whatever we can to allow the music to take off in a certain way, to be disembodied, to be a little bit buoyant.
I was looking at how these quartets were received at the time, and of course, as you know, there was a lot of negative feeling about a lot of them by some critics and some players. But I found this quote by a critic, Adolf Bernhard Marx, who says that if the performers do not constitute an equal union of noble, equal, free, brotherly spirits, no perfect manifestation of the work of art is conceivable, nor is full satisfaction for the players to be hoped for.
Yeah, but
and I think, yeah. So comment on this.
No pressure.
Exactly. I think we could just say that it's extraordinary to hear you talk about how to create it, because we as listeners feel what we feel and know what is happening, but to hear the infinite tiny decisions you've made all along in rehearsing and how each one goes into this. And Richard, I wanted to say you're the newest member of the group. Is that the case?
Yes.
How are you experiencing this gradual work into the life of the quartet, and this piece in particular? You're experiencing the rite of passage now.
Would you like us? Maybe the three of us should leave the room. You know.
Maybe. Not to put you on the spot.
Oh, and well, I guess I was thrown in the deep end in the sense that my very first program with the quartet was involved recording this movement, the Holy Song of Thanksgiving.
Wow.
Which, for some people, they might argue is perhaps one of the most profound things ever written, ever. I mean, in any genre. Yeah. So it's been a dream come true. I mean, you mentioned the Juilliard Quartet at the Library of Congress. I grew up with those recordings, those amazing recordings with Rumori's dad, who I adore as well. I grew up listening to the beautiful Talkash recordings too of the quartets, which are equally profound and amazing, and as well as the Emersons. And I think maybe that's a result of our generation, the luxury. We have everything at our disposal. You know, they were compact discs, now they're streamed, but it was, there are so many profound ways of looking at this profound music, but making that music, especially considering the time we're living in of isolation and loneliness and many people being grounded completely. And for me to drive across the Rocky Mountains literally overnight and sit down with these three amazing individuals and be thrown in the deep end of the pool with this music was a complete catharsis.
Yes, I can imagine. I can imagine. And you today, you were speaking from Boulder, right? You're all based in Boulder now. Yeah, at the University of Colorado. I was thinking one last thing on this, and then to move on, that this really is an avant-garde work, like Opus 131. The way that he wrote it, the extreme contrast, the many pieces of the movement that come together, the number of keys, it is avant-garde. And for us today, it remains this way. I think as I listen to it again and again over the years, I just begin to hear a bit more each time. I remember those Juilliard performances when I really didn't know exactly what I was experiencing, you know. So let's talk about the other quartet that you've spent time studying, and we're so pleased to have your perspective on this. The library owns many holograph manuscripts of Beethoven, and one of the exciting things about our festival is that we're sharing them with a huge audience worldwide. There's a new publication called a LibGuide, and the LibGuide, Beethoven LibGuide, viewers will be able to look at individual manuscripts in detail, to enlarge them and so on, and really study them in a way that wasn't possible until a few years ago. Opus 131 is the fourth of the last quartets, the five great last quartets, and Beethoven's favorite, the longest without interruption at that time, and the most frequently performed. Ed, you've talked about the 7 movements and the complementary nature of how Beethoven puts them together, such an extreme range of emotions and shifting from one to the other with no chance to really prepare. That's an extraordinary challenge for any quartet. So thinking about this from the performer's point of view, I have a question for you. For a 50-minute piece without pause, how do you keep your concentration and your tuning?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it's a question that I certainly ask myself before going on stage for every performance. I mean, I think tuning requires good fortune, obviously, There's no time to tune the strings, but I think actually it has the reverse effect of making me realize how unnecessarily neurotic I am about every single other piece of music that I play, where after each movement I sort of, I'm worried, and you just can't think about it in 131, that you're too busy. And 9 times out of 10, at least I get to the end of it and the strings are fine. They're in tune. If I'm out of tune, I certainly can't blame my strings, unfortunately. So yeah, in terms of concentration, that actually is not so hard. It's partly a matter of what you do in the first half. You don't want to be too exhausted when you come off at intermission. So maybe a slightly shorter first half is good. And then it's such a brilliant story. Everything lasts exactly the right amount of time. So just if you're reading a novel and a chapter goes on too long, then you lose your concentration. But nothing goes on too long. Just at the moment when you might be getting a little bit fatigued, it's a new movement with a totally different character. So actually, of all the pieces that we ever play, this is the one probably the most where I get to the end of it and almost feel like I haven't been aware of myself for the last 45, 50 minutes because I was so immersed in the music.
I think if I could add to that, for me, one of the biggest challenges in terms of pacing in that movement, as you're talking about, is just about emotional stamina, I think, because the first movement, for me, from my perspective, is the most complicated, actually, in terms of my role and voicing and the group sound, but also our individual voices, which is very important, and exactly how that's orchestrated throughout the storytelling of that first movement. And so emotionally, that movement can be extremely draining. But physically, the last movement is the most draining. I'll speak for myself. And so having those two cornerstones on the end of this piece definitely takes almost, for me, like almost a bird's eye view stance. On one hand, my heart has to be completely in it, but I also have to separate myself a little bit from the experience on stage so that I'm not completely drained after the first movement. So that comes from planning ahead and also feeling a shared sense of responsibility with my colleagues. I'm not doing this all by myself, thank goodness. And also what Ed said, just believing in the masterful structure of the work.
There's also, Hiroomi was talking about the emotional stamina. There's one particular moment that I look forward to in this piece. In the middle of the fourth movement, there's a wonderful duet between the viola and cello, where I think I've got like 8 or 9 bars rest, which is very unusual for a first violin part. And it's really a chance both to enjoy the totally beautiful sounds around me, but also just to sort of check in and sort of like find out, if I've been jamming my right leg for the last 15 minutes, or, if my right arm needs shaking about. So it's an actual moment of recovery, if you like. Yeah. And then one can go on with feeling new strength.
Yes. I was thinking while you're talking about something relating back to the Opus 132, that I read that Beethoven conducted that at the premiere, which was a kind of a bizarre image for me at first. And then I was thinking, at that time, it makes perfect sense. Such an extremely complex, thing where minute changes are happening with great speed and rapidity and so forth. In the Opus 131, there's no way to do that. Of course, it's even less possible. But it's the ideas that go by in there are so arresting. How do you not get caught up in them?
I think, yeah, we all fight balancing that in concert of like wanting to be really involved, but not wanting to lose control. Yeah.
I think one thing that helps me with that is it's not just me that's creating all the excitement and passion or sorrow or, insert whatever emotion you like. I don't carry that responsibility alone, but rather I serve a very important function in a larger picture. And so when I feel that sense of responsibility to the text and to my colleagues and to the audience, then I don't get 1000% wrapped up completely and whisked away by the music. I actually feel a sense of responsibility and a specific function in order to make a greater whole, and that helps me really stay on track and stay focused and see how I can contribute to something larger than myself.
We're also always like feeding off of each other's body language and facial expressions, and so
Yeah.
I think that's also a help. Like, let's say I might shoot off a bit fast in one particular passage, then I only have to look over at Ondrash, and very discreetly you might just he wouldn't even stare at me or anything because it's very subtle, but I can just tell from the where his eyebrows are that maybe I should just rein it in a little bit. So
Yeah, well, exactly. The communication means are amazing on stage. I know. I know there's so much to talk about, and I don't want to dwell on too many things. But so a couple of things I wanted to ask your thoughts on. So throughout his life, Beethoven kept his very large collection of sketchbooks with him, and we're going to be talking about our sketch, which is only 2 pages, just a brief glimpse of this work. He moved many times, but he always kept this large collection of books. And for this work, Opus 131, he created a massive number of sketches, 600, which is just mind-boggling. Many of them score sketches with quite extensive ideas working out and so on, and more than 20 versions of this final movement. So our sketch of the Beethoven movement that we're talking about is 2 pages, as I say. And at the bottom of this sketch, you see a note saying it's from Ferdinand Hiller, who was a very young person then. He was only 16, and this particular 2 leaves of this sketch was given to him by Anton Schindler after Beethoven's death. The piece itself, oh, and by the way, he was one of several people to cut a lock of the composer's hair at that time. And we have one of those locks. We don't have that particular one. And that's another conversation too about the hagiography and, the iconography and so on. I wanted to ask you, in this sketch, what kinds of things did you notice when you were studying it that relate to the modern day scores that you see? What stuck out for you?
First of all, I had to feel extreme, and I repeat, extreme compassion for his copyists, because even though we've studied the quartet for 30 years, numerous concerts, or recordings, I had difficulty recognizing what exact part I'm looking at, and maybe I can say I really know this piece in a decent sort of way. I had utter difficulty, and then my colleagues helped me. Which part? The fact that I normally, by looking at a score, if nothing else, the cello line helps me recognize what century I am and what composer we are talking about. In this case, my part is diligently scratched out. I mean, excuse me. I mean, what sort of what would a poor cellist think just looking at an empty line of my responsibility? So I'm amazed. I'm amazed how anyone can make a clear-cut 4-part beautiful score out of what we are looking at.
And actually, I think Richard was the one who actually identified something that sort of told us exactly where it comes from in the piece.
Yes, and I think from the viola line and the first violin, measure 97 is sort of intact. And I think that was the only sort of, if we're going on a scavenger hunt of literal things that he might have taken from basic, as Ed and Hermie and Russian we were talking, it's sort of the development section of this last movement. That is the only literal thing you could actually pull. The second violin and cello lines are not functional. But of course, this is a sketch. But I think one very fascinating DNA, talking about DNA and Beethoven and architecture, because, you know, there's nothing ever excessive, and always he toiled to come up with the most perfect solution. This long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short thing that he only basically used in the last movement of 131 and 59-2. This sort of, some people call it a horse gallop rhythm, but sort of, I don't know, this driving destiny sort of thing with a lot of kinetic energy. That is very, very, I don't know if you could see, but I mean, you'll probably have to show this on the real screen, but it's throughout the entire 2 pages, you can see. I think, so that to me is that he really was very, very dedicated to that long, short, long, short, long, short rhythm. And also the next thing that I think that I could glean from it is this 4-note figure, the setting, the whole note figure, da, di, ta, tum, which is sort of, yes, as you know, it relates to the Bach thing in the first movement. You know, that interval that, of course, Beethoven, what makes it meaningful is you have this complicated structure, and at the very end of this movement, it's just reduced down to this very, very basic interval. The music just basically grinds to a halt, and then it just finishes very quickly. So that also, that 4-note figure also was in this sketch. And then I think the third scavenger clue I think I found was da-da-dum, 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 which is right preceding bar 97, where the development basically winds up into this pedal where Ed is oscillating between 2 notes, another Beethovenian feature where he chooses 2 notes, and they just sort of, it's so insistent, it's Ed part, he's just stuck on this high pedal of against the group, recapitulating all of the movement's ideas.
It's kind of the first violinist being annoying for once. Yeah.
I'm so glad that you saw those things, because I agree with you that it's cryptic. It's definitely cryptic. And I understood then, having looked at this carefully, just how many workings out there are. You know, imagine if so many, 20 different versions and so on. But of course, one can see the melodic variations are somewhat different. The key is there and so on. The main thing was the whole notes. That seemed to be very obvious. But
you know, Anne, sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned like, how would it compare with like something today, a contemporary thing? And I think what we miss today, we miss, if we think 200 years from now, looking back, we won't have something like this with these extraordinarily emotional seeming like crossings out and different ways of crossing out. And you can feel Beethoven's temperament somehow in the process of writing, as he is frustrated by not maybe finding quite what he wants to do, and that very emphatic crossing out of the cello part. Why did he need to do it so extremely? So we have real clues somehow as his personality, which I think nowadays with Finale and Sibelius, which are fantastic, that we're not going to get that kind of information later.
Thank you. I love the fact that you talked about the crossings out. That's a very good point. You're right. You perceive his personality, the emphasis and the drive and force and so on. We will be posting this along with your talk. People will be able to follow it. And I wanted to say, too, that Ed's book, Beethoven for a Later Age, will be a book talk about your book, will be part of what is posted online. So people will really have a good sense of your thinking about these 2 major quartets. There's a tremendous amount of fascinating information. To just mention how the library got this sketch, how the library acquired this particular one. It's interesting because a number of manuscripts in our Gertrude Clark Woodall collection came from the Wittgenstein family, the family of Ludwig Wittgenstein, and the philosopher and the pianist Paul Wittgenstein, who was the one pianist with only one arm who commissioned Ravel and others and so on. During the war, their family had to sell part with a number of their massive music collection of scores. Brahms and Strauss and Mahler were family friends. So as you can imagine, they had a massive music library, a beautiful one. But a number of items were sold, and during the 40s, the library was able to acquire them. So each one has a story, and it's a great thing to be able to talk about some of these stories with you, the stories that you've learned in your work on these masterworks. And it seems unnecessary to go into these tiny details, but they're fascinating. So thank you for your time and talking today about all of these. We are just very grateful, and we really look forward to having you launch our Rehearing Beethoven Festival. Thanks so much, Ed,
Thank you.
Andras, Harumi, and Richard.